From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor with comments on the trends in the cattle markets. He'll talk about the gradual rise in cattle slaughter volumes as more packing plants return to operation, and about continued encouraging news in the beef demand arena. Glynn's in next. Then, K-State's A.J. Tarpoff will talk about accurately diagnosing and treating lameness in pasture cattle. He says that lameness can be inflicted in several ways, and he'll go over how to distinguish the various causes of that condition. Further ahead, Jeff Wickman with this week's 4-H segment. He'll talk with K-State's Aliah Mestrovich Seay about the 4-H Community Conversations program. All that and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. To the cattle markets we go, first of all here, and along with us is livestock economist Glynn Tonsor of K-State Research and Extension. Much to cover here, Glynn, but the cattle markets, the industry still hinging on any word about the resumption of meat processing facilities. And you have a status report here to give us an idea of where we're at.
Yeah, so to paraphrase without numbers, first, the bottleneck of converting livestock into meat is still there compared to where we want to be, but it's easing. So that pinch point in the industry has improved in the last 10 days. And obviously, I hope that continues. But now to use some numbers to get specific, USDA reports this past week, for the full week, we hit 499,000 head, so just under 500,000 head. Now, that's a preliminary note. These things get revised, and after the fact, we'll come back and hopefully confirm, if not be higher than that. For context, that's up from 452,000 the week before. So we're going in the right direction. But yet, same week a year ago, it was 662,000 head. So that's embedded in my comment as we're still down, notably compared to last year, but things are moving in the right direction. The last week of April, at least to date, and I hope sort of permanently, was the lowest production volume, the lowest number of animals processed. Hopefully throughout the month of May, we continue to improve. For quick context, there's a whole bunch of stuff on our Ag Manager website that me and others have been pumping out. One of those is a resource with Lee Schultz. Our listeners get to hear from Lee periodically up at Iowa State. And one of the things we projected at the end of April was a carryover on May 1st of 510,000 head, animals that we wanted to have marketed before May 1st, but we couldn't. If we managed to push over 500,000 head processing the rest of May, so here are the last 2 full weeks of May, then it's possible that we'll start June 1 with under 1 million head carryover. Now, ironically here, under 1 million head would be a good development compared to where we were a couple weeks ago. I mean, everything's relative is the term. The fact sheet Lee and I put out put 4 scenarios on the table for June 1st carryovers that range from, I believe it was 1.1 to 1.3 million head that would have went into June that we didn't want to go into June under normal circumstances. I'm highlighting this because we have an opportunity to keep making progress here the rest of May and maybe get that June 1st carryover under 1 million. Now, that's still a lot of cattle, right? We have a backlog for sure in that story, but improvement is improvement, and I want to highlight that to kick off our session.
And this recovery process, it's been stated many times, it's going to be gradual. It's not going to be sudden. So this is much in keeping with that, Glynn.
Oh, very much so. So, I mean, even if we were running at 660,000 head like we were a year ago, if I'm correct that we have north of 500,000 head carried over, I mean, you've got more than a full operating week just to deal with the backlog, not the ones normally coming at the system. So right. It's not just a days or weeks. It's really going to take months to work through this process.
All right. Well, at least momentum is in the right direction there. The trades this past week, noting on the cash market, fed cattle numbers remain quite low. So that does influence these bids. But we did see some improvement there, did we not?
We did. So the volumes specifically remain low, but improving. And there's different numbers I'm going to give us here, but there's a wide range in these because there's regional variation. There's a lot of stuff underneath this. The Southern Plains Friday quote from USDA was $120, which would be up quite a bit from the week before. The last Kansas specific number I could find was actually for Wednesday, was $115. And then a 5-area price for the week came in at about $111. So you have a whole hybrid, right? And obviously if it's $111, it's a lot below $120. There was a tone that was improving prices throughout the week. That is good and consistent with the general tone that we're processing more cattle day by day. That was the trend that showed up in the daily volume handled, harvested reports. I remain optimistic that if we don't get some more bad news in the next couple of weeks, there's ongoing support for higher cattle prices. But it's not just the price, right? It's P times Q gives revenue. Price is important, but the quantity we're able to push through the system is arguably just as important, if not more important than the price at the moment for a lot of feed yards. And hopefully we see that volume improve. We flip this over to feeder cattle real quick in the cash market. AMS called the Kansas market steady to $5 lower. The volumes have picked up in the last couple of weeks. Now, it's easy to overreact to that. Keep in mind, volumes were way down in March and the front end of April and so forth. So some of this is making up for past decisions. 2 lots, just for context, 240 head weighing 725 pounds went for about $132. And then a heavier lot, over 600 head weighing 919, went for about $115. So you can see the depression of those heavyweight prices in those examples. The board, so round this out, the futures market, while we're on feeder cattle, the May contract was just under $125 for the week, down more than $3 compared to the week before. Different story when we look over to fed cattle. The June live cattle contract was at 97, close on Friday, was up about $2.50 for the week. And of note, that particular June live cattle contract is about where we were on March 10th. So there's been a lot of things developed in the industry since March 10th, particularly the bottleneck processing situation, the whipsawing of the move to retail. I mean, lots of things have happened. But I think we're starting to see the market slowly recover from a lot of those whipsawing. There's room to go for sure. I'm not trying to ignore that, but the direction of the fed cattle market is in the right way, which is nice to note.
On the other end of the chain, the boxed beef trade, noteworthy here that we've seen a pullback in those prices after they've spiked to these record levels. So one wonders if those have in fact peaked, Glynn.
Yes, and I have a very broken crystal ball. I like to note that there's a very good chance they have peaked. And part of that is just the extreme volatility and the rapid rise that's been well noted in other circles. But we closed the week. The choice beef cutout was $434 and change. That's down $17 just from the day before on Thursday, down from $460 on the week before on Friday. Select was a little over $419, down more than $18 just the day before, down from $449 the last Friday. Keep in mind here, the supply story has changed notably in the last 2 weeks. So remember where we started. We're managing to process more cattle. That's going to take the supply squeeze component on the wholesale meat market off a little bit. We're still down compared to where we want to be, of course. But that we have no meat story is easy. We do have meat, right? It's a misnomer to say we don't. So the supply push up is easy. And I think at the margin, some of the Memorial Day run, which COVID puts all normal holiday effects off and so forth. Right. But there's still discussion about wanting to have, meat for specials to the extent you can for Memorial Day and so on and so forth. We've probably ran the course to some extent there. The demand side pull has probably eased. And I know with certainty in the last 10 days, the supply pressure that was supporting that wholesale market has eased. So it's not surprising to me at all that we have had a pullback in this quote unquote red hot wholesale beef market.
Well, Glynn, you noted it a moment ago. agmanager.info is rife with all sorts of information on the cattle markets and beef demand in general here, what's been happening in the domestic and export markets of late, as well as a special impact report that you put together with a colleague out of Purdue University, Jason Lusk.
Yeah, so the special COVID impact report is part of the Meat Demand Monitor project. It's beef and pork check all funded. And again, all these things are on our Ag Manager website. My colleague and friend Jason Lusk over at Purdue University helped me write that report. And a couple punchlines of that special report is we started the month of May with about 60% of the U.S. Households having quote-unquote normal, same amount of meat stocks at home as same time a year ago. Of that other 40%, a higher number started with more meat at home than those that started with less meat at home. I'm highlighting this because that effort in March and April to quote-unquote hoard, fill the freezer and so forth helped us start the month of May with normal or higher than normal meat stocks at home. I think that's easing some of the angst around the disruptions in retail meat flow. I'm well aware of that angst, but I think it takes the edge off that some. Half people are observing changes in the volume and variety that's available, consistent with rationing and limits on purchasing. And perhaps most importantly to note here, beef and pork remain staples in the diet. We confirm that in this project month after month. That part hasn't changed. But there's growing concerns. Those households that have already experienced a decline in financial conditions, unemployment, laid off kind of things, or are pessimistic about future financial conditions, have notably weaker meat demand. That's not surprising. That's why folks like me talk about bad macroeconomic conditions are bad for meat demand, but that shows up in this special report as well. I encourage folks to use that. Back up a month earlier, the other stuff that's on Ag Manager comes from USDA in different ways. March domestic demand was very strong. Beef was up 18%, pork off about 2%, chicken up 13% compared to March of 2019. I'd argue that beef story had a lot to do with the hoarding stories that we had the last 2 or 3 weeks in March. And then export demand is just stellar, to be honest. March of 2020 compared to March of 2019. Beef up 6%, pork up over 50% yet again, broiler meat up over 20%. That export demand growth is supporting livestock prices across the board. It's also become politicized as we have disruptions in the domestic meat flow story that we can talk about. What's important there? I get the question, should we still be exporting when we have those domestic discussions? For the most part, we don't export the same items that we consume here at home. So it's not a simple one-for-one displacement. But as a general statement, the products we're sending abroad is adding value to livestock producers without really taking desirable product away from domestic consumers.
So your point there is, should we be exporting beef products? And a clear yes is your response.
100% yes. Let markets work. What I'm really trying to press on those outside the ag circle is those products are not the ones that we normally consume here at home. Because my household doesn't eat beef tongue, as a simple example. That's an item that's worth a lot more in Asian markets than it is the Tonsor, Kansas household market. Generalize that. That adds value to the whole animal and therefore livestock prices without disrupting domestic meat availability.
We always appreciate your insight, Glynn. Many thanks. Take care.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
He is Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, Kansas State University, and with this week's cattle market remarks on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. As we share more important input for you cattle producers with stock out on grass now, turnout has occurred in most circumstances. Our guest is going to ask you to closely monitor the herds through the next several weeks and even months for lameness in those cattle. A.J. Tarpoff is with us, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension. A yearly occurrence, A.J., lameness is not anything new, nor is it unusual. The consequences of lame cattle, though, can be significant.
It really can. Like you said, lameness is something we battle year in and year out. There's a lot of factors that we can't control that sometimes leads to increased lameness rates. The weather, the environment, the footing that these animals are walking through, all can lead to increased rates of lameness. But the losses are real. Okay, and most of those losses, whether you're in the feedlot or a stock or backgrounder or a cow-calf, a lot of it leads to increased cull rates. Okay, if we have an animal that does not recover from some of these lame conditions, that's where our major losses come from, are some of these animals that are either railed or culled, and that's one of the reasons they leave the herd is lameness, and it's a big one.
When we think about cattle lameness, though, one of the first conditions that comes to mind on the part of many a producer would be foot rot. And you might remind us of the nature of that condition.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the very common causes of lameness in pasture settings during the spring and summer months is foot rot. Foot rot is not every lame animal in the pasture. Okay, it's a very specific condition. What happens with foot rot, it's caused by a bacteria. And that bacteria is very common in the environment, in the digestive tract of cattle. It's known as ubiquitous. It's everywhere. That bacteria is fusobacteria. necroform, also causes liver abscesses in cattle as well. What happens is we need a breakdown of the protective barrier of the foot, and that usually occurs in between the two toes. We get cracking, we get softening of the skin, especially in some of our very wet conditions, where we can have softening, and all we need is some type of abrasion to the protective skin surface. That allows the bacteria to get from the outside to the inside to really cause that infection. Now, when we think about lameness, specifically with foot rot, we can see obvious swelling. When the bacteria gets underneath the skin and that bacterial infection begins, we actually have symmetric swelling all over the foot. As we get closer to these animals, we have that very unique, pungent smell that's associated with foot rot.
Unique's being kind.
Yes. And that's something we use all our senses whenever we try to diagnose these animals of any of these conditions. If you come up to a herd and you're downwind, believe it or not, you can pick up that pungent smell that we know right away, okay, yes, there's a foot rot somewhere in amongst. We need to go pick that animal out.
So those are the ways to identify the condition and then addressing it. Well, antibiotics will help here.
Absolutely. So that's been one of our mainstay treatments of foot rot for a lot of years. We have a lot of different product availability that we can utilize. Work with your local veterinarian, your local practitioner. Ask what they recommend in your certain situation on what we're supposed to be treating with. So, yes, usually we treat with an injectable antibiotic to help treat pasture lameness, okay, specifically for foot rot. Also on the market, just to keep in mind, there is a product for pain relief. Okay, it's a topical product that's actually labeled for foot rot now, which is the first pain medication that's actually labeled for cattle.
As you said, though, earlier, AJ, not all cattle lameness is foot rot. There can be what you describe as asymmetrical swelling. What's that about?
Correct. So these animals will present very similarly as foot rot. That's why it's always critical to get a good look at the foot, the joints, making sure we know where the swelling is, where it's isolated to on that lame leg. And where I talked about symmetric, equal, smooth swelling for foot rot, sometimes we will have different conditions where we just have one toe. The skin just above the hoof wall on one toe sticks out to the side and is very swollen. And that is our asymmetric swelling. It's not equal on both sides of the foot. It's just located on one side. This usually is associated with the deeper structures of the foot. Where foot rot is usually a subcutaneous, just underneath the skin infection, these unilateral or asymmetric swelling cases typically have the underlying structures involved, which could be bone, tendons, or the joints. These conditions we need to get on for treatment with pretty aggressive treatment as soon as possible. And just treatment with an injectable antibiotic is not enough for most of these cases, and the success rates are quite low. That's why work with your local veterinarian. There's a lot of more aggressive treatments that we may have to do. Sole abscesses, okay, that start from a stone bruise, something associated like that, where we can pare out that abscess. We can allow that to drain and to heal. To help with some of the pain, we can actually glue a hoof block. So we take all the pressure off of that affected toe. It's amazing that just putting those blocks on really makes a huge difference in how those animals move. The lameness completely goes away, and it's temporary to allow that affected toe to heal. So work with your local practitioner on that. Many veterinarians around the state have tilt chutes that we can put those animals on their side and work on their feet. If not, we can actually sedate them in the pasture and be able to work on them in field settings as well.
Well, you say also that calves, in particular, can be susceptible to something called septic arthritis, joint swelling in effect. And what's instigating that?
Those are some conditions that we see obvious swelling. They might be packing a leg as they go through the pasture, but it's the joints themselves, some of our big joints. We're talking about the carpi on the front leg or the elbow, possibly the shoulder, on the back legs, the hocks or the stifle up by their belly. Okay, we'll see this big swelling. Now, we call it a septic arthritis or a polyarthritis. Poly is just multiple joints that are affected at once. In our weaned calves, this is most associated with some of the bacteria that are associated with pneumonia, okay, bovine respiratory disease. We have a couple of bacteria that very specifically cause arthritis issues or polyarthritis issues after a bout of respiratory disease. The typical time is we get newly fresh-derived stocker calves. One gets sick with pneumonia. We see the depression. We treat them. They get over that bout. Okay, they actually respond pretty well. They're going about their business, and a week to 10 days later, possibly 2 weeks later, after that initial bout of respiratory disease, we see this arthritis event. So polyarthritis, septic arthritis, there's a lot of different names, but we have a lame animal. We can treat these animals with injectable antimicrobials, but we have to keep in mind that it takes a long time for these arthritis events to recover. So they don't move around very well. They need a nice, comfortable, well-bedded area to be able to rest and recover, which could take a month or so. So we don't give up on these animals. We can have pretty good recovery rates, but they need a very comfortable setting to be able to get water, to feed, and to rest.
And lastly here, there are situations where an animal is lame, but there's no evident swelling. That could be one of a couple of conditions, you say.
It is. So when we don't see swelling, we need to think about a few other things. And a lot of this comes down to kind of the class of this animal. If we have cows out in the pasture and we go out and we see this animal that is, it's almost three-legged lame, but no swelling. And whenever it tries to walk, it walks on its very tippy toe. And once we get a little bit closer, we see this bright red lesion over the heel bones. This is not foot rot. This is actually what we call hairy heel warts, okay, or digital dermatitis is another name. Strawberry foot rot is another name that is used as well. This condition, it's only a topical infection. If we just give an injectable antibiotic, we don't have very good success rate. This is where we use a topical astringent or antibiotic that we're able to spray or apply to the outside heel bulbs of the foot to be able to treat it from the outside, because that's where the infection is. The other that is more common with our stocker animals, okay, our freshly arrived calves, possibly transported long distances. They have this weird shifting lameness, and it's coming from the back end. They're kind of hunched up, but they're standing very awkwardly. Their feet are very splayed apart. They might be standing with their back feet crossed. If you see an animal with its back standing and its back legs are crossed, something is very painful in that animal. That is not normal. So when we see these awkward stances, we need to look a little bit further. Okay, these freshly arrived animals may actually have toe abscesses, which is also called toe tip necrosis. So very painful condition. Usually it is on a back foot on the outside toe. In order to diagnose these, we actually do need to run them into a chute. We pick up their feet, actually with a nylon rope and a pulley to the top of the chute. Once we pick up that foot, we can use hoof testers. We can, similarly as what they use for horses, we can use hoof testers to put some pressure on both of the toes. The affected toe, it is very painful. The animal will remove its foot rather quickly. Once we know what toe it is, we actually take hoof nippers and we will remove just a small amount of the hoof and sole right at the tip of the toe, just enough to relieve that pressure in order for that abscess to drain out into the environment, and then we can follow up with systemic antibiotics. Again, use your veterinarian's recommendations on what products those should be. But again, with toe abscesses, if we don't open them appropriately, the chance of healing and the success rates are almost none.
Consultation with your veterinarian is often essential to know how to respond to these conditions as they might turn up, particularly as we get into the grazing season around Kansas, which has commenced. We appreciate the input. AJ, many thanks to you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
AJ Tarpoff with that word on monitoring cattle for lameness and what to look for producers. He is a beef veterinarian with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back on this Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you. Now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, just as people were asked to flatten the curve on COVID-19 infections by staying home and keeping a safe social distance, some in the cattle industry have a proposal that they believe will flatten the curve on fed cattle numbers. The idea is to help cattle feeders market cattle, factoring in backlogs with less of an economic setback than would occur otherwise. That flatten the curve comparison comes from a senior animal protein analyst with Rabo Agri-Finance, Don Close. While he said there may be challenges with this program, he's hopeful it will help with the number of backlogged cattle on a week-to-week basis. Close said, quoting here, if the program can pull fed cattle off the market, buy some time through this period of reduced slaughter, and extend them out to when we assume slaughter will be back to normal or close, we might be able to balance the fed cattle inventory by the end of the year. Now, the details of this fed cattle set-aside program, as they're calling it, are numerous and, to some degree, fluid. The plan comes from the Beef Alliance, developed using USDA and CattleFax data. According to the Alliance proposal, the steps are built around what's become a limited harvest capacity to process market-ready fed cattle weekly. The tool would be voluntary, with a goal of reducing immediate pressure to harvest fed cattle until processors are at a sufficient capacity to handle those. The managing director of the Beef Alliance, Mary Sukup, told DTN that reaction to this set-aside program proposal has included a lot of questions. Now, what has been proposed as a voluntary tool a feeder could use in an emergency situation, Sukup said there are intentional triggers in the program that would, based on processing capacity thresholds, allow the program to be shut off when the industry returns to more normal capacity levels. Asked what those thresholds would be, Sukup said the details are still being established. USDA still doesn't have a sign-up date for the new aid package called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, but Farm Service Agency offices will start training for enrollment this week. That's according to a notice sent out to state and county offices. The department cannot provide full details on the $16 billion CFAP until the final rule is approved by the White House Office of Management and Budget. That rule was sent to OMB back on May the 5th and is still listed as pending review. Still, USDA officials held a webinar last week providing some bare minimum details of the program. Much of the webinar was focused on forms that producers must fill out to be eligible for direct aid, especially if those producers have never enrolled in aid programs through the FSA. Now, the USDA first announced on April the 17th it was releasing $16 billion in a direct aid package to producers from the CARES Act. That aid package is expected to provide $9.6 billion to livestock producers, $3.9 billion to commodity crop growers, and $2.1 billion for fruit and vegetable growers. Also $500 million to farmers who grow other various niche products. Payments were initially expected to be limited to $125,000 for each commodity, with a $250,000 payment cap, but USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue told Brownfield Radio last week that the payment limits have been adjusted after hearing from livestock groups regarding their financial losses. Adjusted gross income for producers is expected to be capped now at $900,000 unless at least 75% of a producer's income is derived from agricultural production. The FSA Deputy Administrator for Farm Programs, Bill Beam, who's also a farmer in eastern Pennsylvania, said on the webinar that the USDA will begin taking applications for CFAP soon, though the date is not known yet. Once that happens, producers can then call the local USDA service center to set up a phone call appointment. For farmers or livestock producers who've not traditionally received aid, they will need to fill out a bevy of USDA forms. That paperwork can be filled out if it's not already on file with the USDA. Beam also cautioned producers to not send any personal information to the USDA without first initiating contact through a phone call. Incidentally, in our regular FSA Coffee Talk session, we'll be talking with State FSA Director David Shem tomorrow, as a matter of fact, with more details as they're becoming available on that aid. While many processors of agricultural products are operating at a reduced pace now, one agricultural product processor seems to be busier than normal and it has relevance here in Kansas to be sure. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
While production and exports of U.S. wheat have been declining this year and expected to drop again in the new marketing year, one use category for wheat has enjoyed an increase, and that's the making of flour by our domestic wheat millers. USDA's Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski told us that normally this milling number changes very little month to month, year to year, but USDA has just added 7 million bushels of wheat to its estimate of this current year's wheat food use at 962 million bushels.
That increase most likely reflects just that consumer demand for flour has been very strong ever since the sort of home isolations have increased. People have been turning more toward home baking and building up their own supplies and pantries, and that appears to be what we've observed.
Jekanowski says for the same reason, the use of wheat to make pasta is also on the increase. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And the USDA is finalizing a rule now to change how the agency will regulate genetically engineered crops, allowing certain crops to bypass the USDA's regulatory process in the future. The biotechnology rule sets a standard for exempting plants from regulatory review if they meet certain criteria. The USDA released a proposed rule last summer, also had released a proposal at the end of the Obama administration, reflecting that the department has been working to revise its biotechnology rules for several years now. Last year's proposed rule came out in conjunction with an executive order from President Trump. Biotech crops are regulated under a three-pronged system in the federal government. The USDA's Animal Plant and Health Inspection System regulates genetically engineered crops under the narrow focus of whether the GE plant would pose a pest risk to the environment. EPA regulates pesticides that could be applied to those plants, and the Food and Drug Administration oversees whether the plant is safe for food. Under the USDA's final rule, certain GE plants will not need regulatory approval from APHIS if they otherwise could have been developed through conventional breeding and have a history of safe use related to plant pest risk. That's a look at today's lead stories from the agricultural news page. This week's 4-H segment is coming your way next. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. One of the challenges that Kansas 4-H has faced during the COVID-19 crisis has been how to effectively transition from traditional face-to-face programming to an online format. Kansas 4-H Extension Communication Specialist Aliah Mestrovich Seay faced that challenge with the Community Conversations program. As a result, she's been working with Kansas State University Assistant Professor of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, Lorenza Lockett, and Jareth Barton, a Kansas 4-H alum and 4-H volunteer, to adapt that program to an online format. Aliah, you have taken on a lot of new ventures in social media and other ways to communicate with folks during this COVID-19 crisis, and you're doing it again. This time you're adapting Community Conversations to an online format. First off, though, give us the background on Community Conversations and why it's important to be able to do this online.
Well, we really wanted to find a way to enhance our communication project area and tie it to leadership communication. And so over the past year, we have piloted Community Conversations with hundreds and hundreds of youth, volunteers, and agents across the state, which has really allowed us to be able to look at innovative ways to have tough conversations that matter about societal issues. Now, it becomes a little bit more complicated during a pandemic to have these types of tough conversations, but we have found a way to look at exploring piloting Community Conversations online.
One of the people who have been working with you throughout this Community Conversations project is Dr. Lorenza Lockett. What exactly has your role been as part of this process?
It's about augmenting and diversifying the participants' pool on the issue of community conversations, augmenting both the participants and educating areas of population pools who don't realize what 4-H is about. Most people think 4-H is about agriculture, raising cows, and raising corn. And so it has two goals. to augment, bring more awareness to what 4-H does, and diversify the pool of participants.
Jareth Barton is a volunteer with 4-H, and you've actually been working on the logistics as part of this?
Yeah, I'm a student out at Fort Hays, and I've kind of taken this on as one of my projects for my leadership degree, and I found really quickly that the Kettering Foundation and National Issues Forums is kind of the organizations that we work with through the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy at K-State, and they actually have the website that you can get on and use, and it has all the materials that we usually use to walk people through these community conversations. They have a whole list of issues that are really important in our communities today and society and things that we struggle to talk about. And what the online version lets us do is it gives all the resources that we usually bring on paper to the face-to-face stuff, and it puts them into one place and really creates a lot of accessibility for different people to get on and use it. And also for our trained facilitators to be able to successfully walk people through a community conversation. In the past, it's been used just through a chat feature for discussion, and we've been experimenting with that lately to see if we can merge that with a video chat as well, something like Zoom that so many of us have gotten used to using every day.
And you were able to do that?
Yeah, so far that's been pretty successful. We're looking here to train our first group of facilitators in the online for an event later in June, but they should be getting trained here just after they get out of school. People pick this up pretty quickly. It's pretty easy to use. It has all sorts of short videos and plenty of instruction to help you along as you work through it. It's mostly clicking and dragging stuff, and then you'll have the opportunity to share your opinion and to hear others out, really to understand an issue better and find some common ground.
Aliah, this is another example of 4-H working with the community working with 4-H to make something happen. How exactly will you set up these community conversations in an online format? What will be some of the things that you'll want to focus on?
Well, we're hoping that it will be a similar yet different experience where young people are going to be able to take the lead and find new ways of interacting and communicating while being able to interface with our community partners, our volunteers. 4-H is a volunteer-led organization. We're really excited to be able to have the collaboration of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work with Dr. Lockett. And so hopefully what can happen is we can actually get this information on community conversations and this very diverse experience to many more audiences across the state than we would have if it had always been an in-person format. So in reality, this might be the silver lining, that we found another way and a diversified way and a more accessible way to communicate.
Well, and these conversations are going to be important moving forward, aren't they, as communities try and get back to somewhat of a more normal operation and really as they try to work out how they're going to move forward?
Yes, we want to make sure that as we're addressing the pandemic, that we're not just being reactive, that we're also looking at not just the short-term outcomes, but the long-term outcomes. And when we get back to the new normal, I anticipate that this online format will continue to be used and possibly even preferred.
Dr. Lockett, what are some of the things that you're seeing that people are really wanting to talk about right now? What are the issues that they have?
Oh, gosh, particularly our young people, mental health issues. They want to address things like open shootings, those kind of things that are going on. Young people are getting more involved in speaking and engaging, and so it's issues like that. And I love the format that we're using. We're talking about deliberation as opposed to debating. We're talking about, as Jared and Aliah had mentioned, seeking common ground as trying to defend and prove who's right and who's wrong. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And this just fits holistically well with my profession in social work. It's about people matter, and we need to hear their voices and have a safe place to have dialogues about very tough things as opposed to avoiding those things. Let's face them. Let's face them humanely. Let's face them and address them respectfully and see how we can work together to go forward together.
Aliah, when will these community conversations start officially?
Well, as Jared said, we will be piloting this at the end of May and developing our online youth facilitator pool. Hopefully we'll be getting some agents and specialists also trained. And then, we had a pretty hefty list of folks that wanted us to come to their counties and districts and do community conversations before the pandemic started. And so moving forward, I anticipate that a lot of this will move to an online format, but that's kind of to be determined at this point.
That's Kansas 4-H Extension Communication Specialist Aliah Mestrovich Seay. Aliah and Kansas State University Assistant Professor of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work Lorenza Lockett and Jareth Barton, a Kansas 4-H alum and 4-H volunteer, have been adapting community conversations to an online format. For more information, go to kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.